The V-22 Osprey shuddered as enemy rounds tore through its hull, hydraulic fluid spraying across Major Nina Carson's instruments. Below, 3 captured American soldiers waited in a mountain compound, counting on her to bring them home. With her aircraft dying around her and orders to abort crackling in her headset, Carson faced an impossible choice: follow protocol and preserve her crew, or risk everything for 3 Americans she'd never met. Sometimes, doing what's right means breaking the rules. The mission began 12 hours earlier. Major Nina Carson stepped into the briefing room and felt the familiar weight of command settle on her shoulders. The afternoon sun streamed through narrow windows, casting harsh shadows across the tactical maps spread on the conference table. She pulled out a metal chair and sat down, her flight suit rustling in the quiet room. Colonel Raymond Harlan walked in carrying a thick folder and a steaming cup of coffee. He set both on the table and looked directly at Carson. "We've got Americans in trouble, Nina." Carson straightened. In 18 years of military service, she'd learned that conversations starting like this never ended well. "How many and where?" Harlan opened the folder and slid 3 photographs across the table. Staff Sergeant Marcus Bell, Corporal Aaron Zhao, and Private Jamie Brooks. Reconnaissance team. They were monitoring enemy supply routes in the Candell Valley when their position got compromised. Carson picked up each photo, studying the faces. Bell looked like he could be her neighbor back home, mid-30s, steady eyes, the kind of man who coached Little League on weekends. Zhao appeared younger, maybe 25, with sharp features and an intelligence that came through even in a military headshot. Brooks was barely more than a kid, probably fresh out of basic training. "When?" Carson asked. 72 hours ago. Intelligence indicates they're being held here. Harlan unfolded a satellite image showing a compound nestled in a narrow mountain valley. Remote location, about 30 miles inside hostile territory. Carson leaned forward, tracing the valley walls with her finger. The terrain looked brutal, steep ridges on both sides, limited approach routes, and a landing zone that appeared no bigger than a baseball diamond. "What's the timeline?" "That's the problem." Harlan's voice dropped. "Our sources say they're being moved tomorrow morning. Different location, much more secure. This might be our only shot." The briefing room door opened, and Carson's crew filed in. Captain Eli Monroe entered first, clipboard in hand and that focused expression he wore before every mission. Staff Sergeant Dana Kim followed, carrying her maintenance logbook, as usual. Sergeant First Class Leo Travis brought up the rear, moving with the quiet confidence of a man who'd been in more helicopter cabins than most people had been in cars. "Gentlemen," Sergeant Kim, Carson nodded to each of them. "We've got a situation." Monroe took the seat beside her. "Extraction?" "3 of ours, captured during a recon mission." Carson turned the satellite photo so they could all see it. "Candell Valley compound, 30 miles in." Kim whistled low. "That's a tight approach, Major. Valley walls on both sides, limited escape routes." "Gets worse," Harlan added. "Intelligence reports increased enemy activity in the area. They know we're coming." Travis leaned over the photo, his weathered hands tracing potential landing zones. "This clearing here, that's our only option?" "Looks like it," Carson replied. 200 yards from the target building. Monroe was already calculating flight times and fuel requirements, his pen moving across his notepad. "Round trip, with time on target for extraction, we'll be cutting it close on fuel." "There's more." Harlan pulled out another photograph showing the compound from a different angle. "Enemy has established defensive positions around the perimeter. Anti-aircraft capability is unknown but assumed present." Carson absorbed this information without changing expression. Her crew watched her, waiting for the decision they all knew she'd already made. In the quiet room, she could hear the distant sound of aircraft engines and the soft hum of air conditioning. "Who's leading the ground team?" she asked. "Captain Troy Keller and his Special Operations Unit. For men, all experienced in prisoner extractions." Kim closed her logbook. "When do we launch?" Harlan checked his watch. 30 minutes. Gets you to target during optimal daylight hours. Carson stood up, and her crew followed. The metal chairs scraped against the concrete floor. She looked at each of her people, Monroe with his steady competence, Kim with her mechanical expertise, Travis with his unshakable calm under pressure. Questions, she asked. Rules of engagement? Monroe wanted to know. Standard ROE applies. Defend yourselves in the mission. Travis shifted slightly. Extraction time limit? Get in, get our people, get out. No heroics, no extended ground operations. Carson picked up the 3 photographs of the captured soldiers and slipped them into her flight suit pocket. Bell, Zhao, Brooks. 3 Americans counting on her crew to bring them home. She moved toward the door, then turned back to face her team. Gear up and run your pre-flight checks. Meet at the aircraft in 20 minutes. She paused, looking each of them in the eye. We're bringing them home. The crew filed out, leaving Carson alone with Harlan. Through the windows, she could see her Osprey on the tarmac, ground crews already preparing it for flight. The Osprey's twin rotors beat the air with their distinctive rhythm as Carson lifted off from the base. Through her cockpit window, she watched the familiar buildings grow smaller, then disappear beneath the aircraft's belly. The afternoon sun blazed overhead, turning the cockpit into a greenhouse despite the air conditioning. Climbing to cruising altitude, Monroe announced from the co-pilot seat. His hands moved across the instrument panel with practiced efficiency, monitoring engine temperatures and fuel flow. All systems green. Carson keyed her intercom. How are we looking back there, Kim? Everything's running smooth, Major. Kim's voice came through clearly from the crew compartment. Both engines performing within normal parameters. Hydraulics holding steady. Carson settled into her seat and felt the Osprey transition from helicopter mode to forward flight. The aircraft's unique design allowed it to fly like an airplane once airborne, covering ground faster than any conventional helicopter. They would need every minute of that speed advantage. Behind her in the cargo bay, she could hear Captain Keller briefing his extraction team. Their voices mixed with the steady drone of the engines, creating a background hum that experienced aircrew learned to filter out. Travis moved between the special operations soldiers, checking their equipment and answering questions about the aircraft's capabilities. Fuel burn looks good, Monroe said, tapping his calculator. We'll have about 20 minutes on station if everything goes according to plan. And if it doesn't? Monroe shrugged. Then we get creative. Carson smiled despite the circumstances. Monroe had been her co-pilot for 5 years, and his calm competence under pressure made him invaluable. He never panicked, never second-guessed, and never failed to find solutions when problems arose. Major, Kim's voice interrupted her thoughts. I'm seeing a slight temperature spike on the left engine. Nothing critical, but worth monitoring. Copy that. Keep me informed. Carson adjusted their flight path slightly, following a valley that would keep them below enemy radar coverage. The mountains rose on both sides like brown walls, their peaks stark against the bright sky. She'd flown these routes dozens of times, but the terrain never failed to remind her how small her aircraft was in comparison. 30 minutes out, Monroe announced. Carson pulled the 3 photographs from her pocket and clipped them to her instrument panel where she could see them. Bell, Zhao, Brooks. 3 faces looking back at her, depending on her crew to execute a flawless mission. Tell me about them, Monroe said, noticing the photos. Bell's got 2 kids back home. 6-year-old son and a daughter who just turned 1. Carson tapped Bell's photograph. Wife teaches elementary school in Texas. First deployment? 3rd. He's career Army, been in almost as long as I've been flying. Monroe studied Zhao's photo. What about her? Tech specialist. Enlisted right out of college with a computer science degree. This is her 2nd tour. Carson paused. She's been sending half her pay home to help her parents with their restaurant. And the kid? Carson looked at Brooks's young face. 19 years old. Joined up 6 months after high school graduation. His drill sergeant says he's got potential, just needs experience. He's getting it now. More than he bargained for. The intercom crackled. Major, this is Keller. My team's ready back here. What's our approach going to look like? Carson keyed her microphone. Fast and low, Captain. We'll come in from the north, using the ridgeline for cover until the last possible moment. Touchdown, your team goes out, we maintain engines running and wait for your return. Time on target? 8 minutes maximum. Any longer and we risk enemy reinforcements showing up. Understood. My boys can work with that. Travis's voice joined the conversation. Weather's holding steady. Visibility unlimited, winds light and variable. Good flying conditions. Copy that. Carson checked her instruments again. Engine temperatures normal, fuel consumption on track, hydraulic pressure steady. Everything looked perfect, which made her nervous. In her experience, missions that started perfectly had a way of getting complicated fast. 15 minutes out, Monroe called. Carson felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came before every combat mission. Not fear exactly, but heightened awareness. Every sound became sharper, every instrument reading more significant. Her hands felt the controls more sensitively, ready to react to the slightest change in the aircraft's behavior. Kim, how's that engine temperature? Still running a little warm, but holding steady. I don't think it's going to be a problem. Let me know if anything changes. Carson began her descent, following the contours of the mountains toward their target valley. Through the cockpit glass, she could see the peaks growing larger, their shadows creating dark patches on the rocky slopes. Somewhere ahead, 3 American soldiers waited in an enemy compound, probably wondering if anyone was coming for them. 10 minutes to target, Monroe announced. Beginning final approach checklist. Carson's grip tightened on the controls. Here we go. Carson banked the Osprey into the final approach, the valley walls rising up on both sides like the inside of a canyon. The compound came into view through the windscreen, a cluster of tan buildings surrounded by walls, exactly matching the satellite photos. Heat shimmer rose from the rocky ground, making the structures waver in the afternoon sun. Target in sight, Monroe called out, adjusting his headset. Looks quiet down there. Too quiet, Carson thought, but didn't say it aloud. She'd learned to trust her instincts over 18 years of flying, and something felt wrong. The compound appeared abandoned, with no vehicles visible and no movement around the buildings. 2 minutes to landing zone, she announced over the intercom. Keller, you ready back there? Roger, Major. My team's set to go. Carson reduced power and began her descent, transitioning the Osprey from forward flight back to helicopter mode. The twin rotors tilted upward, and she felt the familiar change in the aircraft's handling as it shifted from airplane to helicopter configuration. LZ looks clear, Travis reported from the crew compartment. No visible obstructions. Carson lined up her approach on the small clearing 200 yards from the compound. The landing zone was barely large enough for the Osprey, surrounded by rocky outcroppings and scrub brush. She'd landed in tighter spots before, but never under combat conditions. 1 minute out, Monroe said, watching the altimeter unwind. That's when the valley exploded. Muzzle flashes erupted from hidden positions along the ridgelines like deadly fireworks. The sharp crack of rifle fire echoed off the canyon walls, followed immediately by the deeper bark of heavy machine guns. Carson saw tracer rounds streaming toward her aircraft, bright streaks against the harsh sunlight. Taking fire! Taking fire! Monroe's voice rose above the sudden chaos. Carson yanked the controls hard left, throwing the Osprey into a violent evasive maneuver. The massive aircraft groaned under the stress, but responded instantly to her commands. Rounds cracked past the cockpit, some close enough that she could hear them over the engine noise. They were waiting for us, she said through gritted teeth, wrestling with the controls as more gunfire erupted from concealed positions. A burst of .50 caliber rounds hammered into the Osprey's left side. Carson felt the impacts through the airframe, like someone hitting the aircraft with sledgehammers. Warning lights began flashing on her instrument panel. "We're hit." Kim's voice came through the intercom, tight with concern. "Multiple impacts on the left side. I'm seeing hydraulic pressure dropping fast." Carson fought to keep the aircraft stable as hydraulic fluid sprayed across Kim's instruments in the crew compartment. The flight controls felt different now, heavier and less responsive. She had to push harder on the pedals to maintain directional control. "How bad?" Carson asked, pulling the Osprey into a climbing turn to get out of the immediate kill zone. "Bad," Kim replied, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "Primary hydraulic system is down to 40% and falling. I've got warning lights across the board." Another burst of gunfire tracked their movement, rounds sparking off the aircraft's armored belly. Carson heard Travis curse over the intercom, followed by Keller's voice. "2 of my men are hit. We need to get on the ground now." Carson's mind raced through her options. The landing zone was compromised, surrounded by enemy positions that had been carefully prepared for their arrival. But Keller's wounded men needed medical attention, and somewhere in that compound, 3 American soldiers were depending on her to complete the mission. "Kim, give me a full damage assessment," she ordered, pulling the Osprey behind a rocky ridge to break visual contact with the enemy positions. "Primary hydraulics are down to 30% and still dropping. We've got multiple fuel leaks, but nothing critical yet. Left engine is running hot, probably took some fragment damage." Kim paused, studying her instruments. "Major, we can still fly, but not for long." Monroe was already working his calculator, factoring in their fuel consumption and the distance back to base. "With these leaks, we've got maybe 20 minutes of flight time left. 30 if we're lucky." Carson looked down at the compound. She could see movement now, enemy soldiers repositioning themselves, probably preparing for her next approach. The smart move would be to abort the mission, get her wounded crew members to medical attention, and preserve what was left of her aircraft. But Bell, Zhao, and Brooks were down there somewhere, probably hearing the gunfire and wondering if help was coming. "Travis, how are Keller's men?" Sergeant Martinez took fragments in the shoulder, and Corporal Johnson's got a nasty cut on his leg. "Neither one's critical, but they're bleeding pretty good." Carson pulled the photographs from her instrument panel and looked at them again. Bell with his 2 kids back home. Zhao sending money to her parents. Brooks, barely 19 years old, on his first deployment. Another burst of gunfire echoed up from the valley, the enemy soldiers probably wondering why the American helicopter hadn't returned for another attack. They had no way of knowing that Carson was weighing the lives of her crew against the lives of 3 soldiers she'd never met. "Major," Monroe said quietly, "we need to make a decision. Every minute we stay here, we lose more hydraulic pressure." Carson stared at the compound below, heat waves still rising from its sun-baked walls. The enemy was waiting, her aircraft was dying, and time was running out. She keyed her microphone. "Base, this is Hawk 6. We are taking heavy fire and have sustained significant damage." She paused, knowing that her next words would determine whether 3 American soldiers lived or died. "Requesting immediate abort and return to base." The radio crackled with static before Colonel Harlan's voice came through. "Roger, Hawk 6. You are cleared to abort. Return to base immediately." Carson looked at the compound one more time, then at Monroe. "You heard the man. We're going home." But even as she spoke the words, she knew she couldn't live with herself if she followed that order. Carson pulled the Osprey behind a mountain ridge, using the rocky terrain to shield them from enemy fire. The aircraft shuddered as she reduced power, and she could feel the difference in how it handled. The controls felt loose in some places, heavy in others, never a good sign. "Kim, I need the complete picture," she said into her headset. "Everything that's wrong with this bird. Give me a minute, Major." Kim's voice was steady, but Carson could hear the tension underneath. In the crew compartment, she was crawling around the aircraft's systems, checking connections and reading gauges that most people couldn't even pronounce. Monroe was busy with his own calculations, pencil moving across his kneeboard as he figured fuel consumption rates. Based on what I'm seeing, we're burning fuel about 30% faster than normal. Those holes in our tanks aren't helping. Carson looked at her fuel gauges. The needles were dropping steadily, but not fast enough to panic yet. Not yet. Major, Travis called from the back, Martinez is asking if we're going back for the prisoners. Johnson's bleeding's under control, but he wants to know if they should prep for another run. Before Carson could answer, Kim's voice cut through the intercom with her damage report. Here's what we've got, Major. Primary hydraulic system is down to 25% and still falling. I can see fluid streaming out of at least 3 different punctures. The backup system is working, but it's not designed to handle full aircraft control for extended periods. Carson felt her stomach tighten. Hydraulics controlled everything that mattered, flight controls, landing gear, even the cargo ramp. Without them, the Osprey became a very expensive glider. What else? Left engine took some fragments. Temperature's climbing, but it's still producing power. Oil pressure's holding steady for now. Kim paused, and Carson could hear her moving around, checking more systems. We've got multiple fuel leaks like Monroe said, plus damage to some electrical systems. Navigation computers acting up, and I think we lost one of our radios. Monroe looked up from his calculations. With the fuel burn rate we're seeing, and accounting for the flight time back to base, we've got maybe 18 minutes of flight time left. 20 if we're really careful with power settings. That's cutting it pretty close, Carson said. That's assuming the engine doesn't quit or we don't lose more hydraulic pressure. Carson keyed her intercom. Keller, what's the status of your wounded? Captain Keller's voice came back immediately. Martinez is stable. Took fragments in his shoulder, but he can still fight. Johnson's leg wound is bandaged up tight, he's lost some blood but he's functional. Both men are requesting we continue the mission. And the rest of your team? Ready to go, Major. We know those boys are down there waiting for us. Carson stared at the compound through her windscreen. From their position behind the ridge, she couldn't see the buildings, but she knew they were there. Bell, Zhao, and Brooks were probably in some dark room right now, listening to the gunfire and wondering if the American helicopter was coming back. Her radio crackled with Colonel Harlan's voice. Hawk 6, what's your status? We're showing you've pulled back from the target area. Carson hesitated before answering. Base, we've sustained significant battle damage. Multiple systems compromised, wounded personnel on board. Copy that, Hawk 6. Medical team is standing by for your return. ETA? Carson looked at Monroe, who held up his calculator showing their flight time calculations. Approximately 45 minutes, base. Roger. Safe flight home, Nina. The radio went quiet, and Carson stared at the instruments in front of her. Fuel gauges dropping. Hydraulic pressure falling. Engine temperature climbing. Every gauge told the same story, her aircraft was dying. Major, Kim's voice was softer now, almost conversational. I need to tell you something. That hydraulic pressure isn't just dropping slow and steady. It's accelerating. We probably don't have 18 minutes of flight time. Maybe 12, maybe 15 if we're lucky. Monroe stopped writing and looked at her. How sure are you? Sure enough that we need to make a decision right now. Carson pulled the 3 photographs from where she'd clipped them to her instrument panel. Bell's face looked back at her, the same man who coached Little League and had a 1-year-old daughter waiting at home. Zhao, the computer specialist who sent money to her parents. Brooks, 19 years old and probably scared out of his mind. Travis, she called back to the crew compartment. In your professional opinion, can this aircraft make one more approach and landing? Travis was quiet for a long moment. Carson could picture him mentally going through every system, every component that could fail. Finally, his voice came through the intercom. Major, I've been flying in helicopters for 16 years. I've seen aircraft fly home with damage that should have killed everyone on board, and I've seen perfectly good birds fall out of the sky for no good reason. He paused. This bird will do whatever you ask it to do. Question is whether it'll do it twice. Meaning? Meaning we can probably get down there and back up again. Getting home after that. Travis let the sentence hang. Carson looked at Monroe. Her co-pilot had been with her through dozens of missions, and she could read his expression like a book. He was scared, they all were, but he was ready to follow her wherever she decided to go. Kim, Carson said, if we go back down there, what are the chances we don't make it home? Kim was quiet for several seconds. When she spoke, her voice was matter-of-fact, like she was discussing the weather. Honestly, Major? 50-50. Maybe worse. Carson stared at the compound hidden beyond the ridge. 3 American soldiers were down there, counting on her. But she had 4 crew members whose lives were her responsibility too. The radio crackled again. Hawk 6, base. We need your updated ETA for medical preparation. Carson reached for her microphone, then stopped. Once she answered that call, there would be no going back. Carson's hand hovered over the microphone. Through the windscreen, she could see the enemy positions dug into the ridgeline, waiting for her return. Behind her, 4 crew members and 4 special operations soldiers waited for her decision. Below them, somewhere in that compound, 3 American soldiers were counting on her. She keyed the microphone. Base, Hawk 6. We're going back in. The radio crackled with static before Colonel Harlan's voice came through, sharp with disbelief. Say again, Hawk 6? We're going back for our people, base. Hawk 6 out. Carson switched off the radio before Harlan could respond. The cockpit fell silent except for the steady drone of the engines and the whistle of wind through the bullet holes in their hull. Monroe turned to look at her. You sure about this, Major? No, Carson said, adjusting her grip on the controls. But I'm sure about leaving them behind. She keyed the intercom. Listen up, everyone. We're going back down there. Kim, I need you to manage our hydraulic pressure manually. Forget the automatic systems, we're doing this the old-fashioned way. Roger that, Major. I can squeeze maybe 5 more minutes out of what we've got left. Travis, prep for emergency landing procedures. Fast rope deployment, wounded personnel extraction, the works. And get those medical supplies ready for Martinez and Johnson. Already on it, Major. Carson looked at Monroe. I need you to monitor engine temperatures and fuel flow. The second anything goes red, you tell me. Copy. Monroe's voice was steady, but she could see tension in the way he gripped his kneeboard. Keller, Carson called to the back. Your mission parameters just changed. Get in, get our people, get out. You've got 6 minutes on the ground, maximum. Any longer and we might not have enough power to lift off. Keller's voice came back immediately. Understood, Major. My team can work with that. Carson took a deep breath and banked the Osprey back toward the valley. As they cleared the ridge, the compound came into view again, heat shimmer still rising from its walls. She could see movement around the buildings, enemy soldiers repositioning themselves, probably wondering why the American helicopter was coming back after taking such heavy damage. They're going to be ready for us this time, Monroe observed, studying the enemy positions through his binoculars. I'm counting on it. Monroe lowered his binoculars. Come again? They're expecting us to use the same approach we tried before. Instead, we're coming in from the east, over that low ridge. Carson pointed to a section of terrain that looked impossible to navigate with a damaged aircraft. Major, that's awful tight quarters for an aircraft our size. That's why they won't expect it. Carson began her descent, threading the Osprey between rocky outcroppings that seemed to reach for their rotor blades. The damaged hydraulic system made every control input feel sluggish, like flying through thick syrup. She had to anticipate each maneuver several seconds in advance. Hydraulic pressure is down to 15%, Kim reported. I'm manually pumping the backup system, but it's not going to last long. How long? Maybe 10 minutes total. That includes landing, extraction, and takeoff. Carson felt sweat beading on her forehead despite the air conditioning. 10 minutes to save 3 lives, with an aircraft that was falling apart around them. The Osprey shuddered as they flew through the superheated air rising from the sun-baked rocks below. The left engine temperature gauge crept higher, entering the yellow caution range. Engine temps climbing, Monroe called out. Still in the green, but not by much. Can it hold together for one more landing? Monroe studied his instruments. Ask me again in 5 minutes. Carson pulled the Osprey into a tight turn, using a narrow canyon to mask their approach from the main enemy positions. The aircraft responded slowly to her commands, and she had to fight the urge to overcontrol. With damaged hydraulics, too much input could send them spinning into the canyon wall. 2 minutes to target, she announced. In the crew compartment, she could hear Travis and Keller's team making final preparations. The metallic sound of weapons being checked, the rustle of gear being secured, the quiet conversations that soldiers have before going into danger. Major, Travis called forward, Martinez wants to know if he should stay with the aircraft or go with the extraction team. Carson thought about it. Martinez was wounded, but he was still a trained special operations soldier. And they might need every gun they could get. His call, she said. But remind him that bleeding men move slower than healthy ones. Copy that. The compound was coming up fast now, its walls growing larger through the windscreen. Carson could see the landing zone ahead, that small clearing that had looked so tight in the satellite photos and looked even smaller in person. 1 minute out, Monroe announced. I can see muzzle flashes on the ridge. They know we're coming. Let them shoot, Carson said grimly. We're going to be on the ground and gone before they can adjust their fire. The Osprey cleared the final ridge, and suddenly they were in the valley, exposed to every enemy position around the compound. Tracer rounds immediately began streaming toward them, bright lines against the afternoon sky. Taking fire again. Monroe called out. Carson ignored the gunfire and focused on the landing zone. The clearing rushed up to meet them, looking impossibly small for an aircraft the size of the Osprey. She began her flare, feeling the damaged aircraft respond sluggishly to her commands. Kim, give me everything you've got left in those hydraulics. You've got it, Major. This is our last shot. The ground came up fast. Carson could see rocks and debris scattered across the landing zone, obstacles that could destroy their landing gear or flip the aircraft. But there was no time for a careful approach, no time for second chances. Here we go, she said, more to herself than to her crew. The Osprey touched down hard. The Osprey hit the ground with a bone-jarring thud that shook every rivet in the airframe. Carson felt the impact through her seat, but the landing gear held. They were down. Go! 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 Keller shouted. The cargo ramp dropped with a hydraulic whine, and Keller's team stormed out into the afternoon heat. Carson kept the engines running, both rotors turning at full power, ready for immediate takeoff. Through her side window, she could see the special operations soldiers spreading out toward the compound, moving with practiced efficiency despite the enemy fire crackling around them. Kim, how much time do we have? Carson asked, fighting to keep the aircraft stable as rounds sparked off their armored hull. Maybe 8 minutes before the hydraulics give out completely, Kim replied, her hands working frantically to maintain pressure in the backup systems. After that, we're not flying anywhere. Monroe was hunched over his instruments, monitoring the left engine's climbing temperature. Engine's in the red zone now, Major. I don't know how much longer it'll hold together. Carson gripped the controls, feeling the Osprey shudder each time bullets struck the fuselage. The aircraft wanted to drift sideways in the rotor wash bouncing off the canyon walls, and she had to make constant corrections to keep them positioned for a quick escape. Travis's voice came through the intercom. I can see the team at the compound. They're breaching the main building now. Through the windscreen, Carson could see muzzle flashes from the enemy positions on the ridgeline. The enemy soldiers were firing continuously, but most of their rounds were going high or wide. Either they were poor shots, or the unexpected approach had caught them off guard. "Major, we've got movement on the south ridge," Monroe called out, pointing to a group of enemy soldiers maneuvering to get a better angle on the Osprey. "They're trying to flank us." Carson adjusted the aircraft's position slightly, using the Osprey's bulk to shield Keller's team from the new threat. The movement cost her precious hydraulic pressure, but her crew and the extraction team had to get out alive. "Kim, talk to me. How are we doing?" "Hanging on by a thread. Maybe 5 more minutes." Carson's hands were cramping from gripping the controls so tightly, but she didn't dare relax. Every slight tremor in the aircraft could signal catastrophic failure. The left engine was making a grinding noise now, audible even over the rotor noise. "Travis, what's the status on the ground?" "Keller's team is coming back. They've got 3 people with them." Carson felt her heart jump. 3 people. That had to be Bell, Zhao, and Brooks. Through the dust and heat shimmer, she could see figures running toward the Osprey. Keller's team was moving fast, but they were carrying someone. One of the prisoners must be wounded. 30 seconds out, Travis reported. The engine temperature gauge was now deep in the red zone, far beyond normal operating limits. Carson could smell something burning, probably oil or hydraulic fluid hitting hot metal. The Osprey was literally burning itself up to keep flying. "They're at the ramp," Travis called out. Carson could hear voices shouting behind her as the extraction team and prisoners clambered aboard. Over the intercom, she heard someone say, "Get him on the floor, careful with that leg." "Everyone's aboard," Keller reported. "We're good to go." Carson didn't wait for the ramp to close completely. She pulled power and felt the Osprey struggle to lift off. The damaged hydraulics made the controls feel like they were fighting her, and the left engine was producing noticeably less power than it should. "Come on, girl," she whispered to the aircraft. "Just a little more." The Osprey clawed its way into the air, gaining altitude with agonizing slowness. Enemy fire followed them up from the valley, but the rounds were falling short now. They were going to make it out of the immediate danger zone. "How far to base?" Carson asked. Monroe checked his navigation equipment. 43 miles. With this engine performance in our fuel situation. He did quick calculations. "It's going to be close." 15 minutes later, the left engine finally gave up. Carson felt it happen, a sudden loss of power followed by grinding metal sounds that made her wince. Warning lights filled her instrument panel like a Christmas tree. "Engine failure, left side," Monroe announced calmly. Carson immediately converted the Osprey to airplane mode, using the remaining engine and their forward speed to maintain flight. It was like flying a heavily loaded cargo plane with one engine, but it was flyable. "Can we make it?" she asked. Monroe looked at his fuel calculations one more time. "We're going to find out." 20 minutes later, Carson saw the most beautiful sight in the world, the runway at their home base, shimmering in the afternoon heat. She lined up for approach, nursing the dying Osprey toward the concrete strip that meant safety. The landing was surprisingly smooth for an aircraft held together by determination and luck. As the Osprey rolled to a stop, Carson finally allowed herself to breathe normally for the first time in over an hour. Medical personnel swarmed the aircraft as soon as the engines wound down. Carson watched through her window as Bell, Zhao, and Brooks were helped out of the cargo compartment. Bell was walking under his own power, giving a thumbs up to the medical team. Zhao was supporting Brooks, who looked pale but alert. Carson unbuckled her harness and climbed out of the cockpit. Colonel Harlan was waiting for her beside the aircraft, his expression unreadable. "Major Carson," he said formally. "You disobeyed a direct order." Carson straightened, ready for whatever consequences awaited her. "Yes, sir, I did." Harlan studied her face for a long moment, then extended his hand. "Outstanding work, Nina. Those 3 soldiers are alive because you chose to do what was right instead of what was easy." Carson shook his hand, feeling the weight of the mission finally lifting from her shoulders. Monroe appeared beside her with 2 cups of coffee. "So, Major," he said with a tired smile, "what's our next mission?" Carson took the coffee and looked at her crew, Kim emerging from the aircraft covered in hydraulic fluid, Travis helping the medical team with the wounded, Monroe standing beside her with that steady competence she'd come to depend on. "Whatever it is," she said, "we'll be ready." If this story of heroism and sacrifice moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more inspiring military stories. Share your thoughts in the comments below.